And now why everybody comes, of course, is to hear our speaker, Barbara Byrne. Let me introduce Barbara. Barbara is a vice chairman of the investment banking division at Barclays. She serves as the Corporate and Investment Banking Operating Committee and is chairwoman of the Barclays Social Innovation Facility, a cross-business resource dedicated to the development of self-sustaining commercial solutions to social challenges. With more than 30 years of financial service experience, Barbara has been at the forefront of developing long-standing partnerships with some of the firm's most important corporate clients, serving as the primary architect of several of the firm's marquee transactions. Barbara also was here a number of years ago before I was here, and the program committee was thrilled to get Barbara back to speak. So Barbara, you're going to tell us why the market is going up and down 200 points every day, and what we should do going forward. Thank you.
Hi. I'm delighted to be here. I'm coming in into the warm from the cold, so like many of you, have no power. My husband was evaluating getting a generator, so we had another conversation last night. Things are looking good on the generator front. So I wanted to actually tell you when I was last here. So when I was last here is in January of 2008, which was an interesting year. And I was just reminded that that year I said it would be the best of the bad years. It was the worst of all years, followed by even a worse year in 2009 for the markets. I was vice chairman of Lehman Brothers, so I actually was in the front car of the roller coaster that went off the rails. And so I have a fairly unique perspective of what happened, and I could see what occurred. And if I were to show you interesting charts, it's actually important to understand what happened, and I can answer some questions about that. And the interesting way of doing it is to actually look at what happened in a one-week period to the world at large. Because the most brilliant economist that I know of was a practical economist. Please don't tell my fellow theoretical economists that I said that. But it is a perspective, is Mohammed Al-Arian, who's at PIMCO. Was it PIMCO? Debating leaving PIMCO. But if you've heard him speak, and you should, look at his speeches. They're very accessible. They're really interesting. They're very business-oriented as to how people make decisions. The week in 2008, when Lehman collapsed on Monday morning, and it was ordered into bankruptcy by the federal government, which was also a really interesting discussion. But it was ordered into bankruptcy. That week, the government's perspective at that point in time is that decision would sort of address moral hazard. The bad bank gets punished. You know, they take Merrill, which had actually put them into Bank of America Merrill Lynch. Their issues were bigger, but they were so big, they felt this was controllable to put Lehman into that box. If you look at the equity markets on Monday morning, the equity markets on that Monday after the collapse of Lehman rise. But what occurs is, which smart people can make dumb decisions. What you see occurring is there is nothing happening in the credit world at that point in time. So it is what they call an ice nine moment. There's a lot of water, but it's all frozen. Nothing occurs. And the way in which you rapidly see the markets fall apart, if you look at that day, and I've actually advised some kids in writing their thesis, study this week. Because what occurs in what is the Bloomberg Financial Conditions Index, which is an index of a variety of different things from equity to debt instruments that give you sort of a pulse on what's going on in the economy. If we looked at that index over a 25-year period, we would see that in good markets, it goes up by 2 standard deviations and by off of a mean, and down by 2 standard deviations off of mean in a bad market. By Wednesday of that week, that index was a 12.5 standard deviation. 12.5. So when I call up this nuclear scientist friend of mine over here at Princeton, I go, can you give me like an analogy I can use for 12.5 standard deviations so that, you know, I could explain it to somebody who's a florist, like my aunt. She wanted to understand what was going on. And he said, well, you know, that would be like spontaneous brain generation. I said, okay. So to tell you what occurs is that his analogy, which is the best in the world, is the world lost all trust at that point. And the way he said it was, you know, when you go to McDonald's to the outside line, you drive up in your car and you say, I'll have a hamburger, French fries, and a Coke. And the woman says to you or the guy, that'll be $10.22, and you have to pay. And you say, well, where's my meal? And they go, well, you'll get that at the next window. And you don't trust that you're going to get it at the next window, so you don't move. And he said the whole world was stuck at the window. And nobody would move. There were no bills of lading. There was no commercial credit. There was nothing happening. Nothing moved. So it was a complete collapse of the credit markets. And at the end of the day, and the reason why I'm starting there is, today, as you look at the markets, what you care about isn't what's happening in the equity. Well, maybe you care about the equity. It's volatile. But the fact that it's that volatile, although historically it's not that volatile, but it's volatile right now, has a lot to do with actually what's going on in the credit markets. Watch the credit markets. But right now, you're dealing with the rates. I mean, I actually bring good news relative to 2008. Usually in a financial systematic crisis like this, and there have been several of them in the U.S. history, it takes at least 5 to 10 years to get yourself out of it. So the good news is we're 5 years into it. Actually, we're closer to 6 years into this. So we're coming out of it. And in addition to us coming out of it, we have a very unusual dividend that nobody expected, and that is the energy dividend. We're moving very, very close to energy independence on a BTU basis. If you were to look at the amount of oil that we're importing, it's way down. The crude that's being taken from the shale is light sweet crude. That's very good. That crude is actually used on the East Coast, and our refineries are suited for that. It used to come in from Saudi Arabia. There are a lot of consequences from that actually put the U.S. in a pretty amazing position. However, the U.S., we've decreased rates. We basically inflated the price of assets through this crisis, flooding the market with liquidity to be able to sort of recapitalize all of businesses and to be able, especially to deal with the housing crisis. And the housing, if you were to look at housing assets, almost 90% of all mortgages are held by the federal government. If I were to show you the balance sheet of the federal government right now, it's about 4 times the size it was before the crisis. Now, those assets will come off over time. They're stable assets. It's the U.S. investment. But nobody writes about this. But if I can show it to you, there it is. In terms of the money that went into the banks from the U.S. government, TARP, that's been paid back. The only one that didn't pay it fully back was General Motors. And that was done for different reasons. So that's all moved on. Interest rates are about, we've got, finally, a woman in the catbird seat at the Fed. And I think Janet will be cautious, but as she raises rates, you're going to get volatility. Because even though we all know rates will go back up, nobody's really thought through the second, third, and fourth order consequences. I mean, most academics would tell you they have, but something always happens that you didn't anticipate, and that's just life. That's math. You can't, every variable. So what are you seeing right now? As you begin to raise the rates, what you're doing effectively is reducing the amount of purchases of cash that you're putting into the system. What is occurring is where the money had gone, where liquidity had gone, was to emerging markets. It had gone to Brazil. It had gone to India. It went to those markets. And so the tide is going out. The tide had come in, it had been helpful, the tide is going out. And those companies, those countries are the first to be damaged. So you're seeing a lot of noise about emerging markets. Turkey, for example, as well. Turkey should be of a bigger concern because Turkey is a NATO nation, and so from a political, economic perspective, it could potentially be something that could go awry this year. But you never know. Argentina is a self-contained crisis. How many times have we heard Argentina go bankrupt? Multiple times restructuring. So, and the last time they did this was 10 years ago. They're incredibly, actually wealthy country. This shouldn't really be happening, but it is happening. And you also, that is solvable because all they need to do, what they really need to do is to pay off their existing debt and then refund their current debt. And that would actually reduce their actual charges by $75 billion. So that's doable. India, Brazil, Turkey, not as doable. The tide comes out. China is trying to do, the U.S. is 22% of the global GDP. China's about 17.5%. The next largest economy is about 7%. It's Japan. So we've had good news out of Japan. They're starting to try to, they're reducing the cost of their currency to try to gin up their own economy, but they've actually had some movement there. China is growing around 7%, which is very enviable, except it used to be at around 9%, and they're transitioning from an export-led economy, and also importing of commodities as well as infrastructure to consumer. And those are very, very difficult transitions for developing countries and economies. And so you see some bumpy roads along the way. But overall, it is China. They execute brilliantly over time. I wouldn't worry too much on that. And when you look at everyone else, Europe, with the UK is beginning to come out. Europe is somewhat stabilized. Their banks haven't truly been fixed because they never wrote the assets down. Their demographics are against them. They have the worst demographics in the world in terms of just the number of young people versus old people. They're not going anywhere really for the next 5 years. So they'll tread water and they'll gradually work this out over time, but they're not going to be an economic force, and they're roughly equal in size too. If you put all of Europe together, it's about 20% of global GDP, so that's a drag. So the U.S. is looking at 3.5% kind of growth, and that's pretty good. In fact, we are the anchor tenant yanking the world along right now. We're it. And they're counting on us to pull it off. So we need to perform. And that means that it would be really nifty if the guys in D.C. actually thought to address some of these issues. And they are very smart, and they, even though they don't always look that way, and they know most of these issues. So you're seeing a lot of politics. So you did see some, how amazing. You actually got a deal when no one even knew they were discussing one, right? Isn't that great? That means they were being effective. They were in a back room somewhere. We got to reduce the risk factor. Let's move forward. So there's lots of noise, lots of factors, lots of issues. But I think, I'm to be honest with you, we're fairly, I'll speak from a firm perspective, pretty optimistic that we will get growth. And quite frankly, if you can get to 4 or 4.5% growth, almost all of these issues begin to move into a rearview mirror. And then you can get to dealing with what we would call structural issues that have to be dealt with. What are those? In 2007, the U.S. had a $9 trillion deficit. In 2002, it had a $3 trillion deficit. Today, it has a $17 trillion deficit. Because we are spending more money than we are taking in. Because when the tide went out on us, we didn't reduce our spending for any number of reasons, because a lot of it, because we cannot, it's mandatory, it's Social Security, it's healthcare spending, defense spending, we're in a war cycle. And so we spent the money anyway. So last year, 31 cents of every dollar we spent, had a debt element related to it. It's a good thing people lend to us. So it is, but it's getting reduced. But if you look at the spending, the problem is that the vast majority of it, 45% of it right now versus 25% just 10 years ago, goes to Social Security and Medicare. 20% in defense, 20% is an income transfer, the rest is discretionary, which is like very small, right? 5%, 6%. So when people are fighting on the discretionary, they're not fighting. You got to go, why do people rob banks, right? They go where the money is, right? The old Willie Horton. You go where the money is. The money is going to be in the restructuring of those programs, the Medicare, the health care, and the Social Security. They've known this for a generation. They've known it forever. And so how they're going to deal with it will be, it has to be dealt with in a humanely way. It has to be done in a way that is acceptable politically, but it has to be done because it is math. If you don't fix it, you will have no discretionary spending. People say raise the taxes on everything. Well, you can raise some taxes here and there, but you can't raise enough that is actually going to solve the issue. I keep thinking back to when Barack Obama first was elected. I don't know if you won't remember this, but he had the original proposal that we should have a donut. And so we should, on Social Security, over $250,000 a year, we should force people to continue to pay Social Security. And well, actually, if you do that, it becomes extremely expensive for business. And also, causes you to say, what is this program actually anyway, Social Security? Is it insurance, or is it really just a tax for income transfer? And if it is, shouldn't that be what it is? Let's just be very clear and transparent and say that's what it is. I don't have a position on that. I'm just saying I'm a big believer in let's put the apples and the oranges in the middle of the table and have a point of view. So let's take that. So that's the macro perspective. Actually, the Northeast is actually having a bit of a renaissance. Why is that? From an industrial perspective, why is that true? Well, we because of the energy in the shale. You may have a view on the environmental impact. There may be. I'm not going to talk about that. What I can tell you, but this is an economic engine in Pennsylvania. It's an economic engine in Ohio, that the price of natural gas in the United States is 1/3 of what it is in Europe, that the petrochemical plants cannot afford to operate in Germany anymore. They will be building here, and they will be building in the old industrial areas. They will be in the Delaware Valley. They will be in Pennsylvania. They will be in Ohio. Those are good jobs. The largest portion of jobs that went away, 18 to 55-year-old males in construction. They're going to be building property, plant, and equipment. These are going to be good industrial jobs and good building jobs that actually build communities in communities that need to be built. That's coming home. So you actually have some really interesting positive things occurring. And it's not that it's good or bad that Germany's losing that. It is just the way it is. You know, we lost a lot of those things originally to Indonesia because that's where the cheap gas was. These guys process natural gas. We have a 100-year supply of natural gas. We should be able to make this work. That's sort of interesting. You look at the unemployment numbers, they're going the right way. The volatility in the equity markets, that's like watching, I don't watch it that often. Obviously, I have to because it's the market I'm in, but I don't get obsessed by it because we're getting volatility. People are trying to read tea leaves. Also, there's a tendency when you've been so pessimistic that you really want to, you just get locked and loaded in the world being so down. So you always hear this guy's, well, it's going to blow up. I go, probably not. I don't see anything that tells me that that's going to happen. You're beginning to feel the elements of growth. $2 trillion of cash on the balance sheets of the major corporates, the 2,000. That cash is beginning to be deployed. You can see it. M&A is going up. What is M&A? M&A is just the ability to be able to, I have enough confidence to make a bet on myself. I'm going to acquire this business to consolidate, this business over here to extend my reach. We're beginning to see those types of moves take place. Yes, people are buying back stock. Yes, people are increasing dividends. But even that is a sign of thinking that they're undervalued. It's a positive. All of that is good. So, when you think about unemployment right now, I think is about 6.7%. And their goal is to go to 6%. I think the Fed will actually had a lunch with a few weeks ago up at the Council on Foreign Relations. And there was a bunch of folks coming out of D.C., not the least of which was Tim, our former Treasury Secretary. And his view is that they will go further than 6% because they're going to try to get the long-term unemployed back up and back into the market. So real unemployment's closer to about 11% right now if we were to take the discouraged workers and factor them in versus the 6.7. So there is no threat of inflation right now. When did you last hear that? I'm a child that, grew up in the 70s and, saw debts at 16%. So there's no threat of inflation because they will be absolutely pushing against that until they see the sign of inflation. They're looking at much more of the unemployment. Let's take it home to New Jersey. And I was thinking about this, and I didn't have a chance to review any notes. I took some notes on Monday or Sunday when I was home. I was trying to pull some data up on New Jersey. It's sort of fun. I don't often talk about New Jersey, but other people do. So everywhere I go, people keep asking me questions. I travel all over. It's really a fun state to be from.